issues for the session and then introduce our speaker, Master Black Belt Rick Haynes. A lot of material is planned for this 1-hour webinar, so the audio will be muted for the remainder of the presentation to ensure that we are able to get through the entire presentation in the time allowed. We will not be able to hear you, but you will be able to hear Rick. And so do not let this stop you from sending us text questions through the system during the presentation. Rick truly enjoys those questions.
Yes, I do.
If Rick cannot answer your question either during the presentation or at the end, we will either email you or call you with a response. And there will also be a recording of the webinar available on our website, www.smartersolutions.com, within 48 hours. You will receive an email with a link to that recording. And please know, as a participant in this webinar, someone with Smarter Solutions may be giving you a call. If you don't want us to contact you, please let us know that in the feedback survey at the end of the webinar. I will now introduce our presenter for today, Rick Haynes. Rick has over 20 years of Lean Six Sigma experience as a practitioner, and he is one of Smarter Solutions' senior instructors. Through his career, he is certified as a Master Black Belt, a Black Belt, Champion, a Yellow Belt, and along with other teaching and certifying professionals in the Lean Six Sigma areas. His personal Lean Six Sigma work has spanned nearly all business types, including manufacturing, transactional, research, and development. He has worked in all levels of the business, from entry level up to site engineering manager. His life experiences and skills will provide you today with an engaging discussion. Again, thank you for joining us. Please submit any questions you have through the chat function, and I will turn the presentation over to you, Rick.
All right, thank you, Alon. And I did try the webcam for the first time. It's a new GoToWebinar thing. I hope it wasn't too startling. But we're going to get into something fun, quality. Now, if you've listened to a lot of Smarter Solutions webinars before, some of them are marketing, but this is going to be on the side of continuing education. We're trying to expand on a topic that we both teach, but I think a lot of us face, and it's really, what does quality mean in business? Well, so what can we say quality means? And generally, if you look it up in a book, you'll see it's compliance to the customer specifications. We do an awful lot of work in manufacturing back when I lived that world about understanding exactly what the customer wants and meet it. If you look at Lean, you're supposed to provide exactly what they want, no more, no less. You know, these paradigms work wonderful in business that's manufacturing, but what about afterwards? What if there is no specification? What if all you're to do is provide a service or a transaction gets processed? What I'm going to propose is we're going to look at process execution quality. I thought about, when I wrote this webinar, weightiness and putting the tension build as I went to something. I decided I'm going to tell you right off where we're going so you can sort of think about it. But we're going to talk about in this webinar a way to convert the idea of what quality is when you leave manufacturing and in the service or transactional industry, that really it's about how you execute your processes to provide the service or transaction. That's what we're going to be measuring the quality of. And so we're going to talk about quality. I'm going to explain what my concept is, and then we're going to walk through a simple case study that I made up to try to demonstrate how you'd use it. So what about quality? I joined the manufacturing world in 1986 at Texas Instruments. It was on not quite the leading edge, but still the uphill battle about quality in manufacturing. Before me, there had been Crosby training. TQM was, or Total Quality Management, was big at the time. We did quality circles, but it seemed like in the world we were in, the drive was to improve quality in manufacturing for a number of reasons: money, market share, margin. Dr. Deming was big. I actually started before Lean and Six Sigma hit the manufacturing world, so I was lucky enough to see the introduction and go through some of the early phases of it. I worked for a place that got a Malcolm Baldrige Quality Award. There's now ISO 9001, and there's lots of other things. If you stay around, you'll see them all. But in manufacturing, they were wonderful. They dropped in. They helped the way you looked at business. But when I left manufacturing, that model doesn't work as well. initially, what do we do in the service industry? And I'm going to use that term a couple times. I just mean something that you're not manufacturing, providing a service, processing a transaction, doing something that doesn't produce an item that you can judge as good or bad and scrap it. So let's look at this. How do we judge the quality? We have an outcome. The insurance claim gets paid. The RFQ gets written or answered. You process an invoice. How do we know what the customer requirements are? And generally, it was produced or it wasn't. There really isn't a quality of the outcome. And I guess there's the customer satisfaction. We spent a lot of time in the service industry looking at net promoter scores, customer satisfaction, trying to see how the quality of our service providing is. Hard part is it doesn't work well. I mean, at some level, you always have 100% quality in that industry. The claim will always get processed. The phone call will always be answered. You don't scrap it. We're going to talk about RFQs or requests for quotes later, but there's always an answer. It's always produced. So if you look at the outcome, it's 100%. Now, why does that happen? Because we've designed processes so that you do succeed. There's escalation paths. There's the freedom for people to do stuff outside of the process. But in other words, we keep chugging and trying and send it out. So in that world, what do we have to do to look at quality? To go back a little bit to give you some idea of the other views of what the service industry or the transactional industry might have, you can see some here. You know, was I processed on time? Well, there's a lot of SLAs or service level agreements out there that the goal is to get it done in, let's say, 2-day turnaround. But if it's 2.5 days, it's not really defective. That's just the goal. So we can look at a lot of stuff. Did I really hire somebody? Was the invoice really sent? But you get a lot of these are pass fails, which is okay for quality, but you end up just counting stuff and they always end up occurring. There just isn't a defect or a scrap or a quality failure type analogy in this industry. So here's my first poll question. If you understand the traditional view of quality in manufacturing, I just want a feeling for how you all believe that it fits to the service or transactional industry. So Alon should be posting up the poll here. You get to pick one. Fits well down to doesn't fit well, and right in the middle is, I don't really know. But so there is no wrong answer here. Just trying to get a feel for the audience. Plus, on one side, if I have my participants, the webinar, clicking on their screen, it keeps them participating and involved, so it's good too. Lon, you ready to see? It looks like what's coming ahead. Sort of Fits is leading the pack right now. I think we'll give you another few seconds and we'll close the poll and Lon will post you for all to see.
A couple seconds here.
There you go. Now we closed it and it pops up.
Share those answers for you guys.
What you'll see is about almost half of you said it sort of fits. Some people think it fits well. The next highest one is not very well. Thank you for that. What's interesting is if you have a chance to work in both industries, it really is a unique thing. If you've only worked in one, it's sort of hard to tell, I understand. But I think I'm in the not fits very well feeling, and I guess that's why I'm giving this webinar. A lot of this came about with discussions at one of our clients that we're working back office stuff, and the question is, how do they judge quality? Because it's one of their precepts of their business, but then they can't really measure it. So a lot of this is derived out of working with them to put together quality metrics in the service industry. Go back a little bit more in time. I guess when I'm old, I get to do that. But why did quality resonate so well in manufacturing? Well, before I was in there, manufacturing was just about making money, selling stuff. Most of the technology had a bit of a monopoly. Most sales were local. The idea was just produce it. Even if you scrap some, there wasn't a lot of choice. Worry about the customer later, get it done. But as the globalization grew, as shipments and multinational manufacturing happened, a lot of manufacturing turned into more of a commodity model, which meant now I had to actually compete. One of the ways you compete is providing value to your customer, which meant quality. And as price became an issue, it costs a lot if you don't do it right the first time. So a lot of the drive to quality was to get competitive both price-wise and the ability to compete quality-wise with other competitors. I think back a lot, it would happen to cars. I don't know what your ages are, but when I grew up, I got my first car, and you were constantly working on it. Tires lasted about 2 years. You rebuilt your motor every 10 years or so. Now you buy a car, and it runs forever. I got to believe the major car manufacturers have really hurt their business somewhat because now they don't have to replace the car every 2 or 3 years. And I remember my parents and grandparents did that. You got a new car every 3 to 5 years because they didn't last longer than that. So really a lot of this has been due to the quality resonance in manufacturing. So I guess I got ahead of myself, but what we found though, over time, quality did affect the customer. If you got higher quality, you lowered your manufacturing costs, which meant you could price better and you could also return more money to your stockholders and equity holders. Higher quality meant more profit. It meant lower warranty costs, which is generally not estimated well, but if you built it well, they didn't come back and get it fixed. And one I think that we miss, we cover in our black belt and our green belt classes, that really quality increases the capacity of your facility, because anytime you rework, retouch, or redo something, that's capacity that you've wasted because you already used it once. So quality increases capacity also. I think what happens, the customer now started caring more about the price. They started caring about the quality and how much value it actually provided. But what do you see in the service industry? I mean, I have a lucky job here at Smarter Solutions that I see an awful lot of businesses, meet students from all over the world and all different genres of business. What I see generally is the quality department in non-manufacturing businesses is not the same. Many do not even have one, or it's also an adjunct or a side duty for somebody. And when they do have a quality department, generally it's just driving the audit function, maybe metric reporting. If they've got labs or something, it's running the lab analysis. But it is not what it is in a manufacturing organization. For some reason, it's just never been a focus. And I think because of the early stuff, even Six Sigma was about defects. And in the service industry, you don't really have a defect.
And mentioning that, Rick,
go ahead.
we actually have when we were doing the survey, we had a lot of interesting thoughts about the survey and some questions of panelists wanting to, attendees wanting to know why people selected what they did on the survey. And one attendee wrote in, we look at quality in terms of first attempt defects versus getting the final product or service out correctly, but after 5 attempts or rework. So that's just some feedback there that you're getting.
Interesting, because I'm guessing what first attempt is something like first time yield. You're going to find out that that's an awful lot. I may reword that. That's awful close to where I'm going. And you're right. I'm talking about how you produce how you execute your process rather than the final quality of it. So you're right. If it's sent back for review and rework, I would count that as a quality error, and it sounds like that participant does also. So, great. That's all I got to say.
Thanks for the feedback, guys.
You bet. Yeah, and I do like the questions. I'm basically a Lean Six Sigma instructor, and I'm used to being interrupted with questions. I enjoy it, so please put them in, and Alon will just interrupt me if we need to. But so I guess what I'm going to be talking is this reinterpretation of quality from manufacturing to the service industry, which it appears some of you already think about. Let's try it out. Differences in the execution of quality. Manufacturing, we have standard processes, then we determine good or bad quality based on the outcome of a product based on specifications. You ship the good, scrap the bad, investigate it, look for opportunities for improvement. In the service industry, though, we execute our process over and over with escalations, changes, rework, touch-ups, corrections until we deliver a good product. So in this case, we always deliver in the service industry. So if you go by final output quality, it's almost always 100% unless you lost it, which does happen. But basically, all transactions always complete successfully. So standard quality measurements, not applicable. So let's say if we looked at measuring output quality as viewed by the customer here. In manufacturing, There's a scrap rate that we measure. It's the quality we're sending out. But like I said before, the service industry doesn't scrap. They ship everything. So this is basically a discussion that straight up yield is not a real value in the service industry. Well, what are some analogies to manufacturing to the service industry? What's final yield's analogy? Probably customer satisfaction, or it might be returns. But if you're in a service industry, you don't get returns, you get complaints. So that might be the equivalent of yield. What's the equivalent of a scrapped product? I think that's about the best you do, is failures to achieve standards. Now, I see a lot of companies treat this as failure to meet the SLA or the service level agreement, that they're late. The problem is that really isn't a spec. It's not as good, because a minute late or 10 days late are treated equal if not meeting the SLA, but in reality they are different. How about rework? Manufacturing, we track a lot of rework. We look at the hours spent, what fractions get reworked, but it all is kept internal to the process and not affecting yield. But the best analogy I have at service where it might be escalation, where they can't fix it, they tried, so they send it to someone else to do another work again. And I guess the last one on my slide, rolled throughput yield or final throughput yield. I don't know, it doesn't look like FTY, now I don't remember what it spent. But about all the equivalent is the percent of process or transactions that are processed without error. Now, as the student who wrote in, that's really what we're going to be talking about here. Start looking at every time you don't get the first transaction or processing good as a measure of your process quality. Right? You got something there, Alon?
A question here that came in, just going back to your last slide about the scrapped product.
Right.
And they were asking, are you saying that the service equivalent to scrapping is throwing out the effort associated with doing something wrong? It just may have been some
not really throwing out the effort. Scrap is that you invested time in something, manufacturing time and material that you threw away and could not provide to your customer for value. If I look at the service industry, a call center, or processing a claim or such, it goes through the standard process which should have completed the task. If it doesn't, it gets escalated, goes to a new processing path. When I look at that's analogous to you didn't need the first process, you threw away the labor on the first time to escalate it for the second one.
Thanks for that clarification, Rick.
Okay. I mean, it happened to me on the phone today calling in for something. The lady couldn't get it done, so she had to escalate it to get someone else to do it. I go to that person, they start with the same questions all over again. To me, that was a wasted effort on the first person. All right, thank you for that. So what are we going to do? We're going to replace, in the transactional world, the customer specifications with internal process requirements. It's almost like I'm talking about moving the customer to be an internal customer instead of an external customer for your transaction. What we're going to treat as failure to execute the process as it is written exactly is going to be considered a defect or an error. Because if you've been in manufacturing, not all defects produce scrap parts, but they reduce capability, they make it less reliable. There's lots of things that go wrong when you don't follow your process right. Now, what's the problem with that paradigm shift? One, it requires your processes to be good, which I find is a significant weakness when you leave manufacturing where compliance isn't as important. You get processes like install this, or fill out form, or submit, but it doesn't really tell you how. Everybody does it slightly different. So if you have that type of processes written, it's very difficult to enforce them, which leads to the second bullet of a problem. The processes also have to be clear and descriptive. You really want a process written so somebody new you just hired with a minor orientation can go execute the process perfectly. Assume that a new person should just be slower. What you have is a lot of times people cut corners. What's the other issue? Standard processes sometimes are not able to provide the service without escalation. I have, I guess in manufacturing too, but a lot in the service industry, we write a process that's the 80% solution. We just assume that there's an escalation path, that we're going to have people standing by to take the other ones. Now, we design that into service processes, but we would hate that in a manufacturing process. All right. This is really the equivalent of knowing that they can't process everything first time through, so they live with the quality loss, where that is the escalation path. it's an automated process. You know, some percent are always going to be kicked out to be done by hand. You still have to staff those people. So again, that's the quality view, is if you can't create a process that it can run first time through without intervention, I consider that lower quality. So again, we're going to shift the paradigm. It's not what you produce that you're going to measure. It's how well you execute the processes that are written is how we're going to measure quality. Now, I'm going to take a way back here a little bit. We're going to get into Six Sigma, DPMO, and Sigma levels just for fun. But how, let's say we adopt this model, how would you calculate your quality if you're really looking at that? I'm going to really take us back to something they call defects per million opportunities in Six Sigma, and a little combination of how we do reliability statistics and roll throughput yield to propose in the end a way we can report quality on a service process.
Okay, and we want to know from the audience, before you get into that, what's the basis of the claim? Are we assuming that this is a standard process that's not able to provide the service without some sort of escalation? Is this just the...
I would say it's any service process. What I'm going to propose would work even if it's got no escalation. This is just a way to measure a transaction or a service delivery that you always deliver, that you are unable to use the output quality as a measure of your performance.
Okay, and that's whether there's escalation or not.
No, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
In my manufacturing side, we would build in reworks on purpose in our processes so we didn't have to call it rework. So we would put the rework or the escalation process built into our process procedure so that the auditors wouldn't say, ooh, that's a rework. So a lot of service industries, they do that anyway. They just build it in there. It's part of their process to escalate 10% of their work. But I want you to consider that's really not a good thing. Less escalation, better. All right? Any more questions?
Ready to jump in.
All right.
We do have lots of questions for you. Continue to send those in, but some of these we can address towards the end.
Yeah, and I ask Alon to interrupt the ones that look like I might be losing the audience, so I'm free to do that. Next, what we need to do is define what we're going to call a quality issue. And I got 3 suggestions. One is when some action is taken that does not follow the written procedure, we'll call that a defect. So if they follow the procedure, no defect occurs. Right? They don't follow it, even if it's an inconsequential step. But you wrote it in the process and it was not done properly, that counts as a defect. Now, going back to Six Sigma, it's not on my slides, but a defect and a defective. A transaction is either good or bad. It's either good or it is defective. But a defect is a non-compliant event. So a defective transaction may have multiple defects. So defect is the item that's non-compliant. Defective is the state of the transaction. So in this case, if they don't follow the procedure, it counts as one defect against that transaction. We count them up. If an action has multiple steps or multiple activities that are done that are not in the process, we count that as a defect too. And that's a tough one. If they do something that is not documented in the process, should we call that good or bad? And I'm proposing we have to consider that a defect. On the Six Sigma side of me, if they're doing something outside of the process, everybody's doing something different. We have a great source of variation. In a Lean Six Sigma project, I look for those to get rid of them, because either everybody should do it or nobody should do it. And I think that's the paradigm we have to take if we're going to go look at this process quality concept. And if you see that that's sort of like roll throughput yield, meaning what percent of the transaction or the product goes start to finish without any errors, defects, or escalations. So this leads us to poll question number 2. I have an idea where we're going, this process execution quality. I wish I had a better acronym for it, but I don't. But here's our second question. Do you think this concept would be beneficial, or how beneficial is it to a transactional business? So you can go from the Likert scale here, very beneficial to very negative. Where do you feel on it? And if I look at the poll, the top 2 choices are the winners so far. But as more people get in, they stabilize out. Right now, beneficial is the leader right now as we get more and more people in.
And we'll leave the poll open for about 5 more seconds here.
Yep, so you have your moment to type it in.
And share these results.
And the results are?
Beneficial definitely wins.
Beneficial wins. Very beneficial some, and not sure. I'm okay with that. I mean, everybody who's on the beneficial side should take something away from this, and those who are neutral may learn a new way to look at it. So that's great. So I'm going to walk through an example to put some meat on the bones of this concept. We're going to look at generating a request for quote. This is the basic process, and I guess you can tell I'm a Lean Six Sigma guy, got to draw a process map. But the idea is you find a customer need is identified by the Salesforce. Salesforce collects information, sends the information to the inside sales, the people who generate the RFQ. Then what happens is they check to make sure they have all their information. If they have it, they generate the quote. Then they send it to sales. Sales gives it to the customer. What we could consider the win rate as a yield, but if you work in sales that's not really fair because you sometimes don't get a contract. It's got nothing to do with how well you do your job. There's other influences. So I'm going to step away and say, how can we measure how good we produce these quotes by looking at the quality of our processes? And that's where we're going. So what would be a measure of quality or quality characteristic? I could throw in timely. I mean, if you respond quickly. Error-free, pretty clear. And that would answer for a business side. It meets the financial and margin requirements. I mean, I work at Smarter Solutions. They're not a huge company, but we look at every time we pitch something. Does it have a margin that we can live with? Does it meet our financial goals? Does it drive the business in the right direction? Those are all parts of generating a quote. Just got to do it. So is this sufficient? And I propose that it's not, because timely, you can get it out and it can be poor. Error-free just means I didn't make an error on it. Might meet our goals, but it still might be poorly produced.
And an attendee points out we also might want to consider the budget here.
Cost. Cost is one you may want to consider. How much it costs to put the quote out? No errors during creation. We don't do it here, luckily, because we're such a quality organization. But I've seen companies that run through cycles of review and correction and sending back 3 or 4 times to get a quote out. It's crazy sometimes. But the idea is getting it right the first time is really a good goal. And again, as one of the students or the attendees put in, cost is another issue. Another one that's considered, and I know some of our clients do, is did I have to take an exception to our standards to generate it? Is this a quote for something we do as a standard service or transaction, or is it outside of what we normally do? All these are considered quality characteristics for an RFQ. But I'm going to look at it internal, like what I'm trying to talk this whole webinar about. We'll look at the roll throughput yield or the true yield. True yield, again, is 0 because everything gets shipped out. So some of the concepts, defects can really only occur when an action is being performed. Call that an opportunity. So again, the total number of defects are the number of units times the number of opportunities per unit. Defects, now this is a Six Sigma thing back from when I took it in the 80s. But what we do is we take a Poisson distribution, assume 0 defect rate, which I can calculate. I can then back calculate the error rate within my process and actually go calculate sigma levels. Now I'm going to do it for this example. I probably wouldn't propose you do it. This is just sort of me showing off, I guess, when I put this together. I was telling Alon as I was writing this thing, I got carried away with the fun of the math. So there's a little of that in here. All right, so let's go look at it. A quick look, and I used Minitab for this. Let's just assume we have a defect rate, and what would that mean to sigma level or defect rates? Now, I threw in 2 examples here. If you have a 6 sigma level process with 1 million opportunities, in other words, there's 1 million steps and components in your product or service, and you have a 6 sigma process, you still would have a 98% defect rate. All right, we think sigma level is wonderful, but still the concept is the sigma level is about the probability that any event has a defect caused. If you have enough events, you're almost always going to make it bad. That's why lean really does work sometimes, because it simplifies it. It removes the number of steps you do, which removes the opportunities to mess it up. Therefore, quality usually goes up. But let's look, instead of 1 million, what if I had 100,000 opportunities? That would be, again, actions, touches, movements, components, something like that. A Six Sigma level process would be 35% effective. But one of the things I'm trying to share here is that a high Sigma level doesn't necessarily mean you have a great quality process at outgoing quality. And I have on the sides here the actual count if I simulated that sample size or that many opportunities with that defect rate, which is 3.4 part per million defective. But you can see there's still a lot of stuff there. So it does make sense that this, I'm going back, the Sigma levels from early Six Sigma did something similar to this too. But how do we estimate the quality level for the request for quote process? Well, you set your opportunity count, determine the probability of achieving 0 defects, or in other words, a perfect transaction, and then we calculate the quality. Let's go do it. So here is, I put some drill downs into my process. We'll walk through it. The main high-level process, which you can see, I count 4 opportunities. And you can see them there, but the sub-processes aren't counted up yet because we'll drill down there, the 3 shaded blocks. So I got 4. I go to the collect data. So they collect what the customer is asking for, document on an RFQ form, attach the customer documents, and then submit it to inside sales for processing. So I assume there's 25 pieces of information in the form, that they have to collect 25, then they have to record 25, and the form has to be correct. There's 2 customer documents to be attached generally, and then a submission. That adds up to 54 more opportunities to make a mistake, up to 58. Next one, inside sales receives it, checks it for errors. So they have to receive it. They have to check the 25 pieces of information plus the 2 attachments, and then they make a decision to accept it or not. If they've, as you can see in the process map, if it's bad, there's an error, something missing, it goes back to sales to go get the answers. So that would be another 29 opportunities within my process. Now once they've said, oh, I have all the information, now I have to generate the quote. So the process here, is it standard or non-standard? If it's standard, they just generate it. It goes to the sales manager to sign off on it. If they accept it, it gets sent to the customer. Or if it's a non-standard, they don't have a template for it, then they have to go send it to their operations department, I just said, to get a decision made on how the quote would go. And once they get that, then they generate the quote. So again, that would add 89 more opportunities because I decided there's a QC check by the manager who's got to check every piece of information for me correct. And if they missed one or falsely called it bad, it's an opportunity for an error. So I'm up to 176 opportunities right now. Now that's a lot for a quote. Now this whole concept I just went through was very controversial in early Six Sigma times because you could count anything and the counts would be really high to really low, and it does change your estimated quality level. But I took a simple one. But generally you do it by defining before you do or start counting what's going to count and what doesn't. Every handoff would count. Every task counts. Every time you have a format change, anytime there's multiple reviews, all these things are considered a time when you could make an error on the transaction. But you just set a rule and live with it. So how do we find error rates now? Given that, let's go back to my RFQ example again. I studied the system and found the following information. One, if we check how many of the RFQs were rejected by the customer because we didn't format them to their standards, say it's 1.5% were sent back because they were missing something or we didn't put the right information in it. Then we said how many were sent back to sales for more information. 22% were rejected saying, I don't have enough to do this, go find out more information. The quality check by the manager sent back 18% of them for things that they didn't like or there was errors, they wanted it reworded. And also, within themselves, they found 3% of their errors they made on their own, typing, translating, moving stuff around. So those were my errors that I found in my process analysis. Now, how would you do this? Well, one is you just watch the process with sampling or just track different rejector QC points. Some people actually do like a secret shopper. I know it's not, but they follow a transaction and actually observe it being processed. Some places you can actually do a, I can't think of the term, a post-mortem exam. Once it's completed, go pull all the records, see if everybody did everything right. But either way, what you're doing is samples to collect the error rates at each step in the process. Once I have that, we're going to use a combination process, which would be for roll throughput yield and for reliability stuff, where you take not the yield, but you take the yield at every step, multiply them together, and you can see them across the top. It comes to a 61% perfect yield out of this process I defined. So 6 out of 10 quotes go through without error. You roll that around using the Poisson distribution, which I have the equation in a box there. That's half a defect per unit, 0.003 defects per opportunity, because there's 176 opportunities. We're a DPMO of 2,800. Now, if you look that up in a table, since I have long-term data, that would be about a 3.6 sigma process. So what? You're right. So what on the sigma level? But it does say it's not great. What is that telling us? 61% means I have a 39% defect rate. But I also have said before, the customer rejects about 1.5% of my quotes, just sends them back. Which would be the best method to report quality of my process of RFQs? You think one's customer facing, one's internal facing, which would be best? Now, you know where I'm sitting on this. I think the defective rate where you're looking at your process execution is a better measure of quality than the rejection rate. Because I could maybe fix that rejection rate with twice as much labor in there and a lot more reviews and corrections, but boy, I would have made my process both expensive and long, whereas that would have shown up and affected the defective rate. So if I can get my defective rate better, I probably have less rejections, a better sensitive measurement. Now, that's the same logic you might do in manufacturing to pick roll throughput yield versus final yield to drive your projects and your quality program. Oh, I got those other slides come in there. So really, one's process execution quality, one's final quality. So what's gained? If the proposal I'm making here, or this concept works, I think it truly represents the quality of your organization to execute their job. It doesn't hide rework, escalations, poor processes. And it also, this method is extremely sensitive to find your poor or weak processes within your facility, because they're the ones that are spending extra labor, lots of recycling, rework, and escalations. And final quality is not going to get you there. So it's got some advantages on this. How do we track it? Well, you saw what I did in the example, and you might say, wow, Rick was pretty simple with that. But I'm telling you that this is a model that can work. You create a model, an end-to-end process. This time we did request for quotes. Count up all the quality control and review findings that you find by transaction. How many times were the transactions sent back? Track rejections from your supplier, and then audit every now and then to watch execution. You will count up the number of errors that are going on in your process, or the quality level of each step, using the same model where the defect rate is 1 minus yield times yield times yield in each of your steps. You will calculate the defect rate of your process. Now, what seems reasonable in the real world is a business is checking their performance, say weekly, and they calculate each of these yields independently for each step. What's the QC yield? What's the yield of the transactions? What are the escalation rates? We collect these numbers, multiply them together to give my estimated defect rate. The defect rate now isn't really counting transactions. It's using math to combine a series of related events to come up with the overall defect rate, or it's like roll throughput yield. I've talked about it more. Here is a divergent question I'd like you to answer in poll number 3. This topic, was this an interesting topic that for Lean Six Sigma belts, black belts, green belts, to move away from the traditional quality discussion and put this in there? So it's a lot, some not sure. You get to choose useless too if you want. Well, I like the audience of this webinar are now new best friends with a lot really coming up high, because that sort of reinforces the thought of doing this for continuing education. Because if you realize these are not new topics, we're just applying them in a unique way on service industry.
Well, let's show how many new best friends you have, Rick.
Let's go see. What do we have?
We'll share this poll there, and everybody can
67%. 2/3 of you think it's real important. And you know something? I think it is. Not both the topic, but we're also using standard manufacturing tools in the service industry, which can be a great tool to see things change. Thank you for that, everybody. Next slide. That was really the end of that discussion. So if you type in a couple of questions, I'm going to talk a little about Smarter Solutions just because they let me do this for free, so I enjoy it. And you get to listen for free, so you get to hear a little of this. But we are Smarter Solutions, and some of you know who we are already because you got our emails on it. We do a lot of consulting, training, and helping businesses improve. We give scorecard software. We do a lot of business leadership stuff. But what I'm fulfilling with this webinar is another piece that the owner, Forrest Beifogel, likes, is we help build knowledge resources for our students and clients. We have an online resource library with, I think, if you participate in this webinar, you get an email to.
Correct.
That's where they'll get the webinar, but you'll find hundreds of articles and white papers. It's all there for you free. All you owe us is your email address, and we have it already now. But we do topics like this a couple times a year, just cool stuff. But this is our continuing education stuff. We teach all of our courses out of a series of books written by Forrest. The Volume 3 book on the right is the one we teach all of our belt courses out of. It's about we're doing improvement projects, but the Volume 2 one is what we teach to Master Black Belts. It's really the business side of Lean Six Sigma. Wonderful book. We have a project execution guide, like a little checklist what to do. We have a big roadmap that you can't read on the screen, but that's how we teach DPMO. Pretty darn good. It's my third place teaching. It's the best system I've had to teach. So I'm going to throw in a marketing question here for you. I'd appreciate it if you'd answer it. We're just asking, are you looking for training in the future? Any type of belt course? Soon? Maybe this year? Maybe next year? Maybe not at all. Just chunk a couple of them. It's just for our information. See what, this is some of that market research of our audience that just helps us with our stuff. So I appreciate you answering. We're looking at, most of them are just not looking for a course. They're just here for education, which actually fits the topic today. So if you'd close it in a second or two here.
All right, here we go. Thanks for the
responses
and even some of the feedback there on that question about
Did you post it so they can see it?
Sure. Let's share that, applying this approach to political candidates.
Yeah, it's like a reverse Pareto chart.
Okay. And we'll continue on with Rick's slides.
Thanks. We're just about done with this, folks. We have lots of time for questions.
We do have lots of questions we'll get to.
Awesome. What I have here is a scout of our resources that are on our website. If you go to smartersolutions.com, what we'll have along this tab called Resources, the online resource library on the left, Forrest writes a blog on the business side of process improvement, Lean Six Sigma and BPM. The next one's a blog I write and some of my compatriots put in there. It's really a series of questions and topics for belts that I put a lot of student questions in with answers. Write on stuff I like. Then there's Forrest Favorites, which are excerpts from our classes on specific topics that are interesting. Control charting, a favorite CP and CPK is in there. And then there's some glossaries, some books we all like, software we all like, and then copies of old newsletters. The book reading's interesting because it's not just Six Sigma books. We put in great books in there we like. So we're at the end of the prepared material. I covered what quality means in manufacturing, what I'm talking about for my process execution quality concept, little DPMO and Sigma level, though it wasn't that key to the talk. Benefits, we did the RFQ simulation, which I hope made it a little more real to understand what I'm talking about, and then how we talked about how we can model quality performance by using that multiplication of yields. I guess that leads us to questions, Alon.
All righty. Well, let's start here with just the basics. The slides for this presentation can be made available.
Yeah, I think what you'll see is when you do the exit survey, there's a question about that. If you're interested, and if you don't get them quick enough, they'll probably be a day or two till they're ready. You can either write to us or give us a call at the office. I think the information, you have it. But if you put in there, we'll get it sent to you, the slides.
Sure. So
it'll be a PDF. It won't be a PowerPoint, but you'll get a PDF copy of them.
Okay, and then we'll go back up through a couple of the questions we had towards the beginning. the RTY versus FTY. Rick, can you clarify that a little
Roll
bit?
throughput yield is meant to be, it's really the yield of perfect parts. So at any time an item or transaction has a defect on it, it's defective for the rest of the count. That may be clear. Final throughput yield is someone that some other companies use as an acronym for it. I mean, at the final back door, how many of them had been touched, reworked, escalated, or whatever. But some people also count that one differently with final throughput yield is only the yield at the last inspection step. So if the final QC said it was bad, even if they reworked it to good, it would still count as bad. So it depends where you draw the line on counting errors and defects on the final yield.
Great, thanks for that, Rick. Question here about NFRs. Do you consider NFRs or quality requirements as a way of applying manufacturing quality processes to service?
NFRs, not something requirement. And that's an acronym I'm losing right now.
It sounds like not quality requirements.
But what I want to propose, though, is I guess I'm leaving manufacturing and saying anytime you put any internal requirement on the process that you don't execute properly, it counts as a defect or an error. So no matter what you want to call it, if people are doing it different than the process says or different from each other, we count that as an opportunity for an error. It counts against your process quality metric or your roll throughput yield. So all of them, anything, again, what I'm taking a focus is not to a customer requirement, but to an internal requirement of execution. So I don't know if I answered that one, but.
Great. Well, thank you for that reply, Rick. This question, we did talk about this webinar is for non-manufacturing industries, and we talked primarily about the service industry. What about a software product or something besides? Software
products are really tough. When I was at TI, we did a bunch of Six Sigma work on trying to talk about how to measure quality in software. It is very difficult, especially on the coding side, because you could say, well, efficiency is less lines of code, but the thing is software is so iteratively developed. I think that's why we see the agile method so important now, that it's really difficult to talk about software coding because it's always trial and error and putting stuff in. So I don't know how it applies to the creation of software code, but I think in the supporting of it, the responding to bug reports, the sales process of it, the development of the next technology, putting the process through, but probably everything except the actual coding. I've tried it, I've seen people who try it, but I haven't seen what I call successful about applying any type of quality requirement into how people code. So I don't have a good answer to that one.
Got it. Okay, if an activity occurs that wasn't a part of the process, but it satisfied the customer, is that good for the organization, or how do you see that?
See, that's if I was playing teacher-student, I'd ask you to give me an example. But let me try it. It reminds me of I guess, an anecdotal story, which I'm just going to choose to share. I was doing a process audit with one of my peers down in Virginia, and we're watching a complex manufacturing process. And my friend goes, watch this. He goes to the operator, do you follow the process? And I get a yes, sir, I follow it exactly. Ask the next operator, same answer, follow it exactly. And I said, and he goes, Rick, are they doing it the same way? And I said, no, it looks like they're different. And he tells me he is right, both of them. They are doing exactly what the process says. So he goes, the next question to ask is, do you do anything beyond what the process says? And each of them said, yes, they do, and listed different actions. Now, there was a low capability in that process. Things were going wrong they couldn't define or couldn't find, but we tracked a lot of them back to these extra things that people did that thought provided additional value by them. And yes, I consider that a problem. In the Lean Six Sigma world, that's non-standard processing. We're trying to end it. And if it's allowed, chances are both exceptions are not equal. They can't be of equal performance and quality. So if you see that, yes, I would count that as a defect, and it's an opportunity to rewrite your process to select one method or another, because we really don't want a variable execution of our processes based on who's employed at that moment to stand there and do it, because our customer won't see a consistent output or quality. So yeah, if people are doing it differently, even if they're sure that it helps, I would call that a defect in our ability to write a process that works, because they shouldn't have to. So that's my feeling on that one.
Good thought there, Rick. And along those same lines, an attendee asked, based on your example, we looked at a process and assessed it, but when you want to rewrite these processes, do you start from the existing process map for the transaction, or do you create your own from observing the process? Interesting.
At the level I wrote this process map, you'd probably live with it. I'm working with a client right now that chose to write process maps down to, like, sometimes what button to hit on the keyboard and what screen to enter. If you wrote your process map at that detail, you probably do back up. If you wrote it the detail as example, you probably don't need to. What you work on is the activities that occur within each of those blocks. Because I find most businesses at a high level know exactly what they need to do. And at the high level, it never changes. It's the steps within each process block is where you focus on making your changes. Most people, they'd be in a document rather than in a process map.
Right. Thanks, Rick. And here's our favorite question that's always asked from all Lean Six Sigma practitioners. It makes sense to the Lean Six Sigma community, but how do you propose we sell it to the process owners and redefine quality for management?
I would propose the same way I do a lot of stuff in Lean Six Sigma. If you have been trained in this, we got skills that sometimes our leadership doesn't recognize. One of my other peers that I've worked with, one of my mentors said, if they don't believe you, predict an answer and then come back later and you'll see that it's true. In this case, you could generate these numbers and say, it looks like your quality level is really down here, 60%. All right, we're only got 60% good yields here, and look what it's doing with our labor, and just track it. And if you track it and see it changed, or make a Lean Six Sigma improvement of the process, say it costs too much and they have you working on it, if you measure quality this way and then at the end, after your change, measure quality, it will have gotten better because you're not reworking, you're not spending the extra labor. So one thing to do is use it and report it along with other stuff. I find it's very difficult for belts generally to push new ideas in from the bottom up into a business unless you have a concrete example to show its benefit. And one way is to use your project to show both ways. The other is to make a prediction that, that stuff we did, nothing's going to get better. Look at if I measure quality this way, it didn't change. So that's two ways to go do it.
Yeah, and that's actually in line with our webinar from May, where Leslie Binky from TD presented and kind of said the same thing. You create a project and show some success and then create some traction from that.
She's a very successful lady.
Definitely. Question here. A cost balance between the quality of the process as you've defined it and the quality of the content. So once you've leaned out this process, have you looked at design of experiments to optimize the deliverable quality against the process execution?
DOE, or design of experiments, is a great topic. It's actually what got me into this whole field at Taguchi class in 1987. But we find that design of experiments is hardly ever used outside of manufacturing because there are not many X's or factors that you can put in that are controllable enough to run a design of experiments. We've seen a couple done by our clients, but not a lot. They're generally very low factor and very large samples because it's hard to, they don't have a continuous output anyway. So it is hard. If you can do a DOE in your system, it's wonderful. What we find, though, in the transactional world, it's harder because people are such an important part of it. You really focus on standardization rather than optimization, and you end up standardizing pick one. If it gets worse, you pick the wrong one, and then you would experiment around with only one or two factors to make the improvement.
Okay, and this question, you've kind of answered this, but in that type of environment, do you lean it out before you measure it, or do you measure it before leaning it out?
Boy, and the answer is yes. I know that's a bit bad. there are a number of people that believe lean it out before you improvement, and I am not one of them. I can't say that I'm right or wrong, but the problem with pure leaning it out, and again, this is Rick's opinion, not necessarily the views of our ownership and management, but leaning out does a lot of things and spends a lot of effort making change. But if you have a problem in front of you, a lot of that effort may not be directed to change. It's all good, but we do recommend not leaning it out before you run the process improvement. Actually dig in to find the problem and do the leaning out as part of your project rather than lean out and look at it. If I was looking at a business process, I would not lean it out before I start measuring quality for one big reason. You get done with your leaning it out, how do you prove that there was value in it? So if you didn't measure a baseline performance of something, such as the process execution quality or the cost of the process, how can you justify the effort you put into it? So I would never lean it out before I started measuring any process at all.
Very good point there, and I think, you know, what you said there does back up your philosophy there, Rick. So we are running close to the end here, and I know a lot of you guys have meetings. We want to respect that. If you have a final question, go ahead and type it in. We'll try to get 2 or 3 more. One of these questions, Rick, is kind of a testament to how excellent you did on this. We appreciate it, and how great you are as an instructor. This instructor who's attending the webinar is curious. When you have employees from all industries attending your training, how do you ensure that everyone is happy and excited for the entire course?
Well, that's an interesting one. I probably worried a lot more about that 20 years ago when I started, but generally in our model, and I can only speak to that, and it works for us and our clients, is that the material that we teach from is a bit generic, and the instructor then meets the students and adjusts the examples so it fits their environment. But to do that, you also must have an instructor that's been around a little bit. But we tie each example to each student so they can see what it would mean in their business. You also sometimes tie to traditional things that all businesses face. Travel reimbursements, processing invoices. There are things that everybody experiences no matter what the business. Like in the Master Black Belt course, we do a whole example about a hotel. Because if you made it that far in your career, you've been staying in a lot of hotels, and we can then talk about something that is not exactly your business, but it isn't foreign either. It's the best I can do on that one.
Okay. All right. Well, do you have recommendations?
On what?
Attendee is asking recommendations for books about this topic where we can apply Lean Six Sigma methodologies to non-manufacturing.
Well, there's a lot of them. I think the book that we teach the class out of is about half manufacturing, half non-manufacturing, because that's what good textbooks are. The Volume 3 book you can get on our website. There's a lot of them out there, but I don't know if I have a favorite. I'm really one that goes to basic principles and learns to apply them. I think that's sort of the way I did the webinar also. But also on that site, it's not exactly what you asked. But I also recommend to people that even don't train with us is do not take a Lean Six Sigma for X course. Don't take one for service. Don't take one for manufacturing. Don't take one for banking or finance. Because what you find once they say 4X, they have limited the topics you're covering. So that they say that all the examples match that genre. But in my experience, every business has every kind of process you would ever see in a general course. Manufacturing has service processes. Services have manufacturing processes at some level, not as many, but the paradigms are very important, and I do find some of our greatest students apply a manufacturing paradigm to a service industry or a service paradigm to a manufacturing industry to find opportunities they never would have seen unless they came outside of their box. So that's why we recommend a general text that talks concepts rather than a specific one for your industry.
Yes, and those texts that you're referring to are used within the courses. Some of those, you're the instructor for some of the courses we offer. Some are found online at smartersolutions.com. Rick, we appreciate your time.
And I throw in one more. I'm going to go look through all the question set because I guess by tomorrow I'll get a list of all the ones that are sent in. If there's some great ones, I'll send them out. I might make a blog if there's some really great ones that talk about it. But if you also have a follow-on question, whether or not you're a client of ours, you'd send me an email. I will try to do my best to answer them.
Rick, rick.h@smartersolutions.com.
Which I thought it might have been on the start of the webinar too.
Definitely.
But if you just send it to anything@smartersolution.com with Rick on it, it'll find its way to me. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for attending.